Okay, last thing I'm going to talk about is, and this is really just video, just a brief summary of what's in the book and the notes, with respect to the history of ownership and land registration, what's called the historical backdrop. We just start out with the year 1066, the invasion of England by the French Duke William of Normandy. He has a claim on the English throne. He arrives in England with a fleet, defeats the king who is there presently, who's a Saxon king, at the Battle of Hastings. He claims all of the land of England for himself. He sends out people to survey the entire country and to count every farm and sheep and village, and he claims this for himself. This is what's called the theory of eminent domain, is that behind your ownership, your deeds, mortgages, etc., the crown is the ultimate owner of land and is sort of the theoretical land, and we own our land under the control of the crown, or they grant us the land. Back in the old days, the king, because he had military followers, he parceled out the land. So William the Conqueror had to reward his Norman knights, and he gave them titles to land, and they had aristocratic titles, and they became the landlords, and they had tenant farmers. But the land, whenever a noble died, his son had to go and swear an oath of loyalty to the king before the king would re-grant the land. Eventually, over the centuries, the concept of feudal tenure and the alienability of land grew up, and that, based on that theory, the crown is behind and is the ultimate owner of land, but we have the right to sell land, we can transfer land to whomever we want, we can give it to somebody else, we can mortgage land if we need money, but it is subject to this limitation that the crown could, in certain circumstances, take our land. So the most common example would be expropriation. They're expanding an airport, and they're taking people's land, they're paying them compensation, but ultimately the government is successful in doing that because they have the power to do that based on this original theory. In some circumstances, you have a corporation doesn't pay its taxes, it's dissolved. Where does ownership go? Corporation ceases to exist. Somebody must own the building that they have title to, and based on this theory of eminent domain, if there's nowhere else for it to go, it goes back to the crown. The same thing in an intestacy in an estate. If there's no will, if there's absolutely no next of kin, so if they follow the Succession Law Reform Act, which is if you don't have a will, the Succession Law Reform Act governs where your property go. If there's nowhere for it to go, they can't find a living relative, then it goes back to the government based on this theory of eminent domain. Okay, in Canada, we set up our provinces. The province of Ontario was divided up into counties. There are a number of counties in the south, larger districts in northern Ontario, and they subdivided those into administrative units, townships, because there were no towns or cities originally. There were areas in which farmers moved in, and if you read through the book, it explains how those concessions were arrived at. They sent out surveyors. They divided up the township into a grid with lots and concessions. There were road allowances that were put in between the concessions, and the whole lot and concession system, which we go into later in the course, was the basis of legal description. So you might be Lot 1, Concession 1, Township of Flamborough East, County of Wentworth. That would be your legal description, and that's how it was originally set up. With respect to the original farmers that came out, most of them bought their land from the Canada Land Company, which was in charge of selling off pieces of land. Canada Land Company received their land. So if you search back title on many properties in Ontario, you'll see, for hundreds of years going back, you'll see the original Crown patent, that original transfer of land to the first purchaser, which was often this corporation, but it might be an original farmer as well if they bought directly from the Crown. And that Crown patent is a significant document because in some cases, not a huge number of cases, about 5%, they were reservations on the Crown grant. In provinces like Alberta, all of Alberta, as my understanding is, there are reservations for oil and natural gas rights, that the minerals under the land belong to the Crown. That only applies on some properties in Ontario. So if you find gold or oil, it belongs to the Crown because in the Crown patent, and it'll be right there in that original transfer deed, that reservation saying the Crown owns this, that they've held back those rights. Another common one that we find in cottage country, this one's more common, is you can't cut white pine trees. And the reason for that was they were used for sailing masts for ships in case they need to build a navy. The Crown put a reservation. Those reservations still apply to the land today. So if you are buying a cottage in cottage country, your lawyer should check to make sure that there's no reservations on this Crown patent that restrict you from cutting those trees. Because if you cut down the Crown's tree, you could be charged with mischief to property for having damaged their property because it doesn't belong to you. Those trees are not for you to cut. And it only applies to a certain species of trees that they used for sailing masts, the white pine tree. But that's an example of a reservation on the Crown patent, that original transfer.